You're live.
All right.
I'm going to start the recording again. It's live.
All right, there we go.
So I'm going, if I leave, nothing will mess up, right?
Right.
I'm going to start the recording again.
Okay, we're all good.
Right.
So, and now we're,
It's live.
backwards in time. Right, there we go.
So I'm going,
I'm gonna close the YouTube so I don't get distracted by that, and we'll just get things moving. Hello everyone. So sorry for the wait. We got it figured out, but here we are. So happy to have Freddy Perkins here. So I'm Daniel Goldschmidt. I will be kind of the panelist slash background person for this. Um, and yeah, we're just gonna get things started right away. Uh, Freddie, why don't you pull up the PowerPoint and would it be all right if I read your bio at you?
Sure. Let's see what I wrote. I don't remember.
Yeah. Let's see. Um, oh well, now I lost it. Um, I just had it. Oh well. Well, hello, Freddie. Freddie teaches, Freddie music therapizes, Freddie's trained in a bunch of cool things. And we are real messy in our first time. And so I'm so thankful to Freddie's patience. And I don't want to lose any more time for the fabulous content that you've prepared for us. So why don't we get that moving?
Yes, I love it. Also, let's embrace messiness. With
Yes,
all in full queerness, messiness is just a part of the game.
absolutely.
All right, y'all. So let's see. Today we will be talking about sociocultural reflexivity. So a lot of what I attempt or strive to work for in my personal work as a music therapist and kind of just in life is thinking about the ways in which I interact and move through this world and how the things that I have grown up being taught or have learned along the way inform or impact the ways in which I go about my work. And so that is what we are going to sort of talk about tonight in an attempt to maybe start that journey for some people or maybe continue the journey for others if people are already on that journey. First, does the PowerPoint come up? Does everyone see the PowerPoint? Are we good?
I see it. And so I think we're good.
Perfect. Wonderful. Okay. Dun, 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 dun. So I always find that it's helpful just to kind of situate myself and who I am in this space, especially with presentations like this. So maybe it's best that I didn't get a bio, so I can do this myself. For those who do not know of me, my name is Freddy Perkins. I am a board certified music therapist. I am a Black music therapist. I am a queer music therapist. I'm American, specifically American from the South, born and raised and still living there. I am able-bodied. I'm a cisgender male. I am educated. I'm a millennial. That feels important in this day and age. I'm a millennial. So all of those things influence and impact the ways in which I view the world and perceive the world. So I think that's important maybe for folks to know as they are listening and maybe taking things from me and critiquing things from me too. I completely am open to critiques and questions because I by no means am the expert of all things. I have situated knowledge, but I do not know everything. And I think that is a really important thing to note for anyone who is getting into this sort of unpacking and this reflexive work. So the first thing I always like to do is to kind of get people in a maybe more thoughtful state of being is just kind of thinking about a couple of questions. So for those of you watching in your homes or in school or at your job, if you're at work, here are a couple questions I'd like for you to think about. Question one, when people look at you, what do they see? Question two, what do they not see and why? Question three, what do you wish they'd see? And the last question, if others wanted to get to know the real you, what would it take? So if you are watching remotely, think about that to yourself, or if you're watching with a group of friends, maybe discuss it with each other. Um, I will speak for my own kind of experience, and Daniel, you are more than happy to chime in as well. Um, Obviously, I think when people see me, the first thing that they notice is I'm very tall. I know the Zoom screen does not do it justice, but I am 6'4", so I'm a whole lot of person. Obviously, I'm also Black. I think those are the two big things that people probably see from me. Um, in terms of what they don't see, I sometimes I don't know if people always necessarily see sort of how multifaceted I am. I think oftentimes in spaces, the way in which I perform my identities can kind of go down these two different paths of either being really, really extroverted, or in other spaces being really, really introverted. And rarely do people get to kind of see those two things coexist, unless people really know me. And I think the reason for that to some extent is a self-preservation thing. It's definitely a way of protecting myself, for as a marginalized person in some ways. Code switching is definitely a thing that I often engage in. And so I'm very conscious and very aware of when I'm in spaces, who I'm in those spaces with, and what I allow for them to see. I guess on the flip side of that, maybe I wish that they could see more of that integrated, or that more kind of holistic personality that I possess. I think I possess. And if people wanted to get to know me, it would take time. Honestly, it would take time. Trust, if for me, is not something that is easily gained. If you ask a lot of my friends, they will tell you very quickly that I am a proverbial brick wall in some ways when it comes to what I let people in on and what I share.
Would you like me to share my answers as well?
Yes, please.
Sure. Yeah. So when people look at me, well, as a genderqueer person, it kind of depends on what I'm presenting as in a given day or in a given environment. I would so when I'm wearing a lot of makeup and stuff like that, or a dress or things like that, they see, depending on the environment, some people see a question mark. Like, not quite sure what we're working with here. And in other spaces, I'm seen as a genderqueer person, and so, and then my Jewishness is also pretty visible, and I get the "What are you? Where are you from?" question more than most white folks I know. But I'm also seen in my whiteness. I'm seen in maleness, and my non-binariness isn't always clear. I have these little hints, in what I wear, and the shoes I put on, the nails I have that day. But I think I'm seen. I don't know that, people don't see mental illness I experience. They don't see a lot of the facets, like you said. All of us are kind of seen in a quick, cover of a book type of way. And I, I wish there was a magical way for people to just magically see I was non-binary. There's so many spaces where even people who should know better just like miss it. And even people who can use, I always like to say pronouns are not a proxy for understanding gender. That just because someone uses they, them doesn't mean they actually see me in my non-binariness and see me in a way that I'm not just a dude who wears makeup, you know? And I get placed, I have those male characteristics placed on me as well. I've been socialized as a man, so I'm not divorced from it. But and if others want to get to know the real me, yeah, I'm kind of the opposite with you than you, Freddie. I'm very open about everything, probably definitely to a fault. So I mean, it's just talking to me. I'm very open about who I am, about what I'm about my ethics, and what got me here. And I think I'm pretty direct and honest about the good and the bad and everything in between.
I'd agree with that. In the small like instances, even I feel like it's been so long since we've actually seen each other and interacted in person. But like in those interactions that I recall, like that all feels very true.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Thanks for asking.
So, this is a really great quote that I got from Ken Bruce, a book called The Forms of Reflexivity in Music Therapy. So if anyone's ever interested, that is definitely a book I would encourage people to check out. But it's essentially saying reflexivity is a value that is essential to all music therapy endeavors. It does not belong exclusively to one orientation or approach. And I think that is really important for us to think about. I think sometimes maybe because of the world we're living in right now and things feeling very divisive in a lot of ways, a lot of the thinking that is now starting to come into music therapy around like social justice and sociocultural lenses and working from anti-oppressive lenses, I think maybe sometimes is assumed to only be for certain ways of doing this work and doing the work that we do. But I think there's space in any type of music therapy that's being done, regardless of whether you're in a nursing facility or a hospital or in a children's home or in school systems. I think there's a place for reflexivity, and it's crucial to the work. It's crucial to the integrity of the work.
I'd love to
Um,
add something to that, if I may.
yes.
And I'm sorry that I didn't actually introduce myself at the beginning of this in like kind of the hubbub, but part of my background, without giving the whole thing, is that I've spoken a lot about white supremacy in music therapy. And so whenever I do those talks in kind of in what you're presenting here, something I like to say is that all therapists of all backgrounds need to have, in cultural reflexivity, have to have awareness of awareness of biases, awareness of cultural difference, awareness of all these things. Music therapists are doubly responsible because the medium through which we do intervention is cultural in and of itself.
Yes.
So when you're saying like, all folks need to do this, it's not just that all music therapists need to do this, it's that we're doubly responsible because our interventionary medium is in and of itself tied to cultural experience and cultural expression.
Yes.
So it's like really paramount. And yeah, so and I try to frame that it's like it's not just like we should do it, it's like we're doubly responsible because of our interventionary medium.
Yeah, thank you for saying that and naming that, because it's essentially kind of two forms of reflexivity we have to engage in, right? Like we have to engage in reflexivity of ourselves, but also the music, right? Like that in itself is something that is reflexive. Music is a living, breathing entity and a thing that needs to be carefully thought about, especially with the ways in which a lot of us engage and work with music with the people that we work with. So thank you for naming that. Something I wanted to let folks know, in the corner of some of the slides, you'll see a QR code. And I believe if you scan that code, it will bring you to a site where you can type in questions. So if you ever have questions throughout the PowerPoint or throughout the presentation, you can submit them there and we will get to them either throughout the presentation or towards the end of the presentation. So, for anyone that's brand new to this, what is self-reflexivity in music therapy, right? I put sort of two definitions. I kind of gave you like the AMTA approved definition, and then I gave you my definition. So in the technical sense, it's a process in which the clinician is examining their own beliefs, judgments, and practices within the therapeutic relationship and process, right? That feels really sanitized. So the way that I like to think about it is it's really just having a conversation with yourself, an ongoing conversation with all the parts of yourself about what you experience as you're experiencing it, and really being mindful about the impacts of what you're experiencing, how you're experiencing, and how your whole self is involved in that process, right? So there's this meta communication that's happening internally, but there's also the communication that's happening externally as well, right? Especially when we're talking about working with people or working with entities. And so there has to be this level of flexibility in your communication. And so in layman's terms, it's an ongoing conversation, right? And I really want to stress that ongoing, because even once this presentation is done, right, yes, you'll have maybe some tools or maybe some takeaways, but that does not mean that's the end of your journey, right? Even me, someone that has been doing this for a couple of years now, like my journey is still very much ongoing, and sometimes I have to revisit some things that I haven't revisited in a while to kind of get myself a tune up in some ways. So always remember that this is ongoing and it's a process. So don't expect yourself to be perfect at it. In fact, in the beginning stages, it might be really messy, right? And that's okay. In fact, the messiness is important and integral to the process. So when we're talking about reflexivity, I think one of the important things to start with is intrapersonal communication, right? And all that means is it's that self-talk. It's what are the things you are telling to yourself in your mind, in your head? What are the things you're saying, right? So we think about intrapersonal communication as this mirror, right? So it's mirroring your values, it's mirroring your beliefs, it's mirroring your biases, right? So all the things that you're telling yourself in your mind have been things that you've taken in from different avenues or different people or different systems, and that's creating the dialogue that you're having inside of your mind. And it's important to be aware of that, because intrapersonal communication is the starting point for any type of communication, right? So when we're moving from intrapersonal to interpersonal, right, with somebody else or with others, it's stemming from that beginning interpersonal dialogue, what you're saying to yourself. And an important part of that is recognizing that interpersonal communication is not just the conscious things that you're saying. So like when we go about our day and we're actively saying things to ourselves that we are very cognizant of and aware of, but it's also the things that we aren't necessarily readily aware of, right? So in our unconscious brain, what are the messages? What's the internal dialogue happening there that isn't so readily available to us? Or when we're in altered states, whether it is daydreaming or when we're asleep and actually dreaming, like what's happening in those altered states? What communication is happening there internally? So that interpersonal piece isn't just talking about the things that we're aware of that we're saying to ourselves, but the other parts too that maybe we aren't so readily aware of. And when we start understanding our interpersonal communication, it is the starting point for being able to understand our values, our beliefs, and our biases. And if we can do that, then that allows us to work in a way that feels holistic and feels like it honors the relationships that we're forming with the people that we work with. Whereas on the flip side of that, if we are not understanding that interpersonal communication, then it opens up space and room for us to unintentionally cause harm to people and marginalize people that we're working with. Interpersonal communication is also a reflection of our thinking, right? I've kind of said that, but specifically our thinking styles, which I'll get a little more in detail about those thinking styles a little later. But yeah. Whew.
Yeah. So when and pause me if you're gonna cover this in the next bit, but that idea of like that ongoing conversation with yourself and being aware of your values and being able to kind of take a step back. Do you have any recommendations for folks who are listening that like what's a good question to ask yourself, or what's a good way to actually approach this for someone who maybe already thinks they do it or doesn't do it at all?
Yeah. So I think there are ways in which we're aware of the talk that we have, right? There's this book that I really recommend for people that are interested that's called Social Justice, Multicultural Counseling and Practice by Hee-Soon Jun. And in the book, they mention that, a lot of us, when we think about the interpersonal communication, when we're actively thinking about it, what immediately comes to our mind or what we're immediately aware of is the negative self-talk that we do to ourselves throughout the day, right? And so that already is a piece of that conscious intrapersonal communication, right? And so when we stop and think about that, for those of us who engage in negative self-talk in one way or another, if we really stop and think about it, where are those things? How did that come to be, right? How did it come to be that we just started having this self-talk or this inner dialogue that is so skewed towards negativity, right? And I'll touch a little bit on it, actually, I think in the next slide. And I have an exercise, hopefully, that we'll be able to do to kind of start trying to bring some of those things to the forefront. But I think maybe the easiest place to start is with the conscious thoughts, the conscious self-talk, right? And really taking a moment to say, oh, what do I know that I do? But when you want to get deeper, it really has to come from a place of allowing yourself to be vulnerable and honest, because if we try to start going to those deeper places, right, some of the things that may come up might not necessarily be what we determine to be the best things, right? And so that's when defenses come into play, and we want to push away and not claim or not take accountability for. But we'll get into that in a little bit.
Thanks, Freddie.
Yeah. So as I was saying, maybe a lot of times when we start thinking about that conscious intrapersonal communication, it may be the obvious thing is, oh, I do a lot of negative self-talk, right? So that negative intrapersonal communication, that starts to bring us into this place where we start having automatic thought processes, right? So if you are someone that often feels like you do a lot of negative self-talk, and whatever that looks like for you, or whatever the specific words are for you, what starts to happen is, because your intrapersonal communication is just you talking to you, there's no other feedback that you're getting from anyone else to negate or work against. So it's you in your head reinforcing maybe something that started as like one simple fact, but you fabricated all these other things and fed it into this fact that has now created this cognitive distortion, right? So now there's this distorted view on something that maybe started out as being factual to some extent, that now you've gotten in the habit of doing. And so now it becomes an automatic thing, right? So for example, for me, growing up Black in a world where darker skin is not looked at as a great thing, and oftentimes you get treated negatively for it. There have been ways in which, even in my own family, that message was completely emphasized a lot. For anyone that was a marching band kid back in their school days, you all know that summertime is game time, and you are out in that sun all day, every day. And I would come home a couple shades darker. And I remember having moments where my mom would tell me, she would make comments about how I was so much lighter as an infant, and then would say, oh, what happened to my baby? He used to be so light skinned, and now he's just so dark, you need to stay out of the sun. And while I know her intention was not to like cause harm, I think what that did for me is started creating this dialogue in my head that said, my skin is too dark, or I'm not beautiful because my skin is too dark. And so this distortion started coming up in my head, which actually leads to this next kind of bullet point about how these automatic thought processes are fed by the thoughts of culture, parents, churches, temples, digital images, social media, anything that we interact with in the different systems that we exist within, feed that intrapersonal communication. Those messages feed us and tell us how we should think about certain things, or how we should interact with certain people, or with certain images, or with certain ways of being, right? And so that starts to feed this interpersonal communication that then becomes an automatic thought process, right? I think maybe an example that comes to my head is, I remember around the time when 9/11 happened, right? And there was a lot of xenophobia that happened towards members of the Muslim community. And, of course, because of those events, security measures around airlines got a lot stricter, right? And so having recollections or having spoken to people who have shared thoughts about like, oh, being on a plane shortly after that and seeing someone who gets on the plane who's wearing a turban, like, what are your first thoughts about that person? Purely just based off of one article of clothing that they are wearing, right? And the assumptions that you're making. And those assumptions are being fed to you because of what the systems are telling you about someone who is wearing that article of clothing, right? So it didn't come from, you didn't originate that thought. That thought was fed to you by a cultural phenomenon, right? It was fed to you by this event, and then it was fed to you by all these people who had opinions about this event and the people who they presumed were involved in that event. And now we've made this generalization that anyone who even remotely matches something related to that event must fall into this category. And so it's kind of this trickle down process of how this bigger, larger system feeds us these messages. And then we take those messages and we form belief systems around them, whether we actually believe them or not. We take them and we utilize them to inform how we move about our own worlds. And it's feeding that interpersonal communication, right? So in the same ways that we can do negative self-talk, right, we can do the same things to other people and have that negative interpersonal communication that is centered around somebody else. And so because of that, things that are fed to us become the basis for automatic thought and interpersonal communication. So that leads us into thinking styles. So similarly, in the book that I mentioned earlier by Hee-Sung Jun, they break down thinking styles into 4 different types, right? So the first one they talk about is linear thinking. And essentially, linear thinking is this idea where your train of thought, you're using the past to predict what you think is going to happen in the future, right? So you're making generalizations based off of something you've experienced and then using that to make an assumption about what will happen, right? So that is, let's see, an example of that would be, if let's say I had a meeting with somebody and that person happened to be Black and that person was late to the meeting, right? And then let's say 4 months later, I have another meeting with somebody who also happens to be Black. If I make the assumption that they are also going to be late to this meeting purely because they're Black, I've engaged in linear thinking because I've used something that I've experienced in the past to inform what I think is going to happen in a similar situation, even though the person involved is different, right? And the only thing that connects the 2 individuals is one singular identity marker. I've completely erased all other context from the situation, and I have limited my thinking around it. So that would be an example of linear thinking. The next style of thinking is dichotomous thinking, right? Which is essentially the this or that thinking, right? Good or bad, best or worst, right? So putting things in these extremes, right? I think one of maybe the most poignant ways in which I see this a lot just in my work is around gender, right? Like seeing gender as being male and female, and that's all it is, this binary way of thinking, and not really leaving room for anything else in between, or acknowledging that things can exist outside just that dichotomy, or sometimes that dichotomy just doesn't even need to exist at all, but we do it, right? I think as individuals, especially when we start kind of doing this work of unpacking some of the dichotomous thinking that we may engage in a lot, is seeing ourselves as good or bad, right? So when someone tries to hold you accountable for something or call you in for something, and you find yourself feeling defensive and ready to defend yourself and say, oh, well, I'm not this or I'm not that, right? I think that is that dichotomous thinking coming into play in your mind, saying, feeling as though this person is trying to label you as bad, whereas you want to be seen as good. So you're going to refute what they're saying to you, as opposed to letting go of having to view yourself as good or bad and just view yourself as is and taking in what's being said, right? And I think that's a really important piece of diving into this work. Is this has nothing to do with you being good or nothing to do with you being bad, right? The decisions you make are the decisions you make, and they're just that, right? The decisions, we're not using the decisions to qualify your character. The decisions are just what you make. We can qualify the decisions, right? And say, maybe that wasn't the best decision, or maybe a better decision could have been made, or maybe that was a really good decision. But that doesn't translate to you being good or bad based off of a singular decision, just in the ways that I would hope that we don't do those things to our clients or the people that we work with, and labeling them as succeeding or failing based off of what happens in a therapy session, centered around what we have deemed as goals or what we have deemed as being the things that they need to work on. So that's dichotomous thinking. The next thinking style is hierarchical thinking. So that is essentially creating a tiered list, right? From like, this is the not even best, but this has maybe the most power, to trickling down to the least amount of power, right? So this superiority and inferiority ranking system in music therapy, or in any form of therapy, right? There's this inherent hierarchy that exists when you go into that therapeutic space with a group or with an individual, because they're going to view you as the therapist and say, oh, you know all the answers, or you have the things that I need in order for me to better myself or to grow in the ways that I feel like I need to grow. So they've already put you on this pedestal. They've created this hierarchy for you, right? Just in the same ways that we can create that hierarchy on our own ends by saying, oh, well, I'm the therapist and I know what I'm doing, so therefore I know what's best, right? Where if we were to step outside of that hierarchical thinking and say, yes, I may be the therapist, I may have situated knowledge around some things, but I don't know this person's life in the ways that they do, right? That starts to kind of diminish that inherent power dynamic that happens. And then it leaves space for collaboration to happen a lot more frequently within the therapeutic context, right? So thinking about the hierarchies of therapy, but even outside of therapy, how we hierarchalize other things in our systems. Like when we're in school, like who do we give the most respect to in school? Like we give it to the principal, and then it goes the vice principal, and then the teachers or the coach, or however you rearrange that in your head. Or when you're at home and you're with your parents, like who do you find yourself giving more power to in your household, right? Like those are ways in which we create hierarchies. Or even when we're doing tasks at work, we create people who creates to-do list, right? And we prioritize, this is the thing that I really need to get done. Like we hierarchicalize to-do list and priorities and things we need to get done. So that is hierarchical thinking. And then this final thinking style is ideally what we would want to shoot for, which is holistic thinking, which gives us the ability to non-judgmentally think with more context, right? To give things, to look at things as multifaceted and think about them in those ways. So having that multi-dimensioned outlook on a situation and allowing yourself to think about the contextual factors that are at play when you're thinking about how you're going to do something. So in music therapy, for example, when you're working with a client, right, I think sometimes it's really easy for us to see a diagnosis and immediately say, oh, there's this diagnosis, which means there are these symptoms, and this is how music therapy fits into addressing those symptoms. Bam, boom, I have my treatment plan, right? That's not necessarily really holistic, because you've only thought about one aspect of that person that you're working with. You've not thought about their lived experience. You've not thought about their age. You've not thought about their race. You've not thought about their religious viewpoint, if that feels pertinent to the work. You've not thought about their social class. You've not thought about their gender. You've not thought about the full context of who they are. And so holistic thinking would say, let's consider all of those things as we're engaging in what does this work look like for us, or how are we going to engage with these people in work.
I so appreciate you bringing up all these thinking styles. I know I spent a lot of time thinking about dichotomous thought, because there are so many false binaries in our lives that are traps. The gender one obviously gets a lot of attention, with breaking out of binary thought, but even, I mean, every political issue in this country with a two-party system becomes a binary, either pro or anti, which of course makes invisible everything in between.
Yeah.
And and as I see this list, I myself do all of these, in various ways in different times, and there's some hierarchical relationships that are okay, and there's some time, like I think of, elders, and supporting elders, giving them food first, things like that. That's a hierarchy that I'm cool with, but so often, the hierarchies of academia, of workplaces and things like that, cause I know that's something in my Jewishness that we treat hierarchies differently within family, within culture, and who's in charge and having a voice, even when we're hierarchically in a lower position. And that's something that doesn't play well in a workplace or in academia or things like that, where I've always felt, oh, well, I should use my voice. And I've had people be like, what are you doing?
Yeah. I feel that similarly in Black culture too, especially with hierarchies and who gets the voice, right? And oftentimes in our culture, children don't get the voice, right? Children just listen, and we do what's told. And whether they have the right answer or not, that's not the point. That's not the point of information, right? The point of information is usually the parent or the grandparent, and they're the ones that have the answers, and everyone else just falls in line. And any questioning of it, even if the bigger group knows that what's being said maybe isn't the best outcome or the best response, we still go with it, right? Because the value in that community is the respect, right? And so that hierarchy is allowed to stay intact because of that value. And I appreciate you naming that, like, we all engage in these things, and the reason for it is because the system we exist in supports it. It supports these thinking styles, right? So dichotomous thinking, you just named it. Like, we live in a two-party system where if it's not Republican or Democrat, no one cares about it, whether it exists or not, right? And we live in such a divisive country right now where it is so dichotomous that you're either on one side or the other, even though we recognize there's a spectrum between the two, like, because of how things are playing out. In legislation, people slowly but surely feeling like you have to slowly forget the spectrum and move to one of the extremes in order just to find some sense of equilibrium. And so, these thinking styles happen because the systems in which we are brought up in support them and encourage them in a lot of ways. So I bring these up not to say never do these again, right? Because if you can find me someone who doesn't do these things, who doesn't do these first three, then I would be jaw dropped. But we all do it. I think the important thing here is being able to identify when it happens and being able to name it for yourself, like, oh, I'm doing this thinking right now. And then questioning, is this way of thinking really conducive to what's happening? Or do I need to run it back and try something else?
Yeah. The phrase me and some friends use is, why has it got to be binary, when we catch each other doing this or that, either or thinking. And what I like to say is that, the challenge with when you make things binary, it makes everything in the between invisible. And the thing is, that's where reality lives. Reality isn't all or nothing. There are very few things in life that are truly binary. And it's such a trap, and it's all, and social media is another place where binaries love to thrive. Obviously we can't get into it, but with everything going on with Israel Palestine right now, like everything's deeply binary. It's all super for, super against. You're a horrible
Yeah.
person, or you're
Mm.
anti-Semitic. It's like always super far.
Yeah.
And reality doesn't live in the extremes.
Yeah, and it's a bigger call to question of like this understanding of feeling like there's absolute truths, which I think is something a lot of us, because of the system, have been fed to, and that's not the case, right? I think there are situated truths. Everyone has their own truth based off of what they've lived, and each of those truths have validity to them, right? But I think we've been taught and socialized to think that we need a label for everything, that everything has to have this exact thing. And that brings us, we've been trained to have comfort in that, right? We've been told that will give us comfort, and that will give us security. And if we know what the thing is, then we know how to deal with it, as opposed to in this nebulous of not knowing the absolute truth, because there is no absolute truth, and allowing allowing yourself to sit in the discomfort of, oh, I don't know what this thing is. So
Yeah.
right. I think that shows up in music therapy too. Like when music therapists engage with clients, again, I always like to say music therapy sometimes gets stuck in our box of who we work with and what those populations look like. And that's definitely not to discount the validity of that work. But I'm always curious about, well, what would it be like if we expanded outside of that and went into the unknown with populations that would benefit from music therapy as well, but it's just not happening? Is that because there's just this discomfort of the unknown because we don't have the research yet, or because we don't have the textbooks and the theoretical knowledge that says this is what you would do? Or is it something else? It's just all, this could be a much bigger, longer philosophical conversation, but yeah.
Yeah. My last thought on that is just kind of, you were starting to get at that. To me, all binaries boil down to good person, bad person. And when you get to the end of the line, a lot of these binary things become, are you good or are you bad?
Mhm.
Which of course is another false binary. And then you just brought it back to practice that, so often we're dealing with the binary of health and sick or not sick, as if sickness is, or as if health is the not having a diagnosis. And you mentioned the labels, and like that there is comfort in a diagnosis and a box.
Yeah. Or even what we're labeling as sickness. Like, is it actually sickness? Or who's at fault for what's the root of the sickness or the illness, right? Like, it's all these things. And it's so interesting because, when music therapy, for those who don't know, when music therapy first came into existence, like when we think about the therapeutic uses of music and healing way back when, before it was formalized into a career, like, it did not ascribe to this Western ideology of what health and wellness is, and this medicalized way of health and healing, right? It existed in a lot of indigenous communities and worked in ways that served the community and served the individual, right? Where now we live in this world that's so centered around capitalism and making money and medications and getting people in and out of hospitals, that we've had to, again, systems have pushed us to have to steer away from what music therapy innately was, to this new thing of everything's evidence-based and everything has to be proven by something. There have to be numbers to prove it, and not seeing as much validity in the feelings or the words or the experiences.
Yeah. And capitalism, good old fashioned, like, they're like, well, the way we need to make money, insurance won't cover it unless we have this data, blah, blah, yada, yada. And in the Music Therapy 2025, the AMTA thing they put together back, 10, 15 years ago, straight up said, like, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to prove in a medical way that what we do is meaningful. And that is fair because, people want to get paid, and it gets us further and further away from these other uses of music and ways that music have been used for thousands of years.
And this is a really great segue actually into my next slide, which is an activity that I'd like to do. So on the screen, there's a QR code that I invite everyone to scan, and hopefully it works. And it should bring up a Google document. And that Google document is an activity that I call a values inventory. And essentially, what I'm asking of you all to do is to take a minute and sit with yourself and think about messages that you received, whether they were really implicit or really explicitly told to you, whether it was from people in your lives, from events, from media, from church, from school, from wherever it came from your friends. And name what those things were as they're related to race or to gender. Like, what were you taught about race? What were you taught about gender? I think I have on there, what were you taught about health? What were you taught about music? And don't censor yourself, even if it feels like, oh, this is a really taboo thing to say, or, oh, this isn't really a great thing. Don't focus on that, right? We're not here to label it as good or bad. We're here to non-judgmentally just say, this is the thing that I was taught and it has stuck with me, right? By acknowledging it, it doesn't mean that you believe in it. It's just acknowledging, oh, I was taught this thing. And so I invite you all to maybe take a couple minutes to do that. What I will do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen just briefly so I can actually bring up the inventory itself. And the great thing about it is, even if you type in it, it's anonymous, so I won't even know who you are typing.
I just sent you a message with some questions, Freddie.
Oh, great. Let me go to my messages.
Over text.
That's helpful to know. Okay. So, for the sake of time, I invite people to do this, and I will send a link out for people to engage in this, because I would really like for people to kind of have that space, because I think it's a great tool to start. As was asked earlier, like, how do you start kind of doing some of this work? You have to start by being able to name the things, being able to start by saying, what did I learn? And then once you can kind of expose that and be really raw and honest about it, then you can start picking apart, hey, I know I don't actually believe this thing, but are there ways in which I kind of engage in this? For example, I know for me, when I think about like ability and disability, right? Like, something I was taught was that anyone with an intellectual or developmental disability couldn't do for themselves, right? Like, they have to have someone to take care of them. And I don't believe that to be true. Like, sure, maybe there are some cases where that is true to an extent or to a point, but I think there's room for anyone to have autonomy and to be able to do things on their own. But because of that thought process, how does that impact how I work with clients with disabilities, right? Like, because that message is in there, it's sitting in that, it's impacting how I view that person when I walk in that room or when I walk in to that group. It interacts how I see them. It interacts the music choices that I make for them, right? Like, how many of us who have worked with kids in school systems and have been in special education classrooms where you have a kid that is clearly 15 years old, but teachers are telling you that they listen to music that normally 3-year-olds listen to, and you're sitting there abiding by it, right? Like, that is that thinking. That's that thinking, like, that's their thinking coming into play and informing. And then you also, if you co-sign on it, if you say, okay, well, I'm going to play it too, you're co-signing on it, and you're allowing that thought to also exist, right? You're giving that thought power. So
And I appreciate that
Yeah.
you bring up the lateral reinforcement, that generally when we see someone that we're working with, they're not in a room by themselves and we haven't talked to anyone else on the way. Like, there are staff, there are family members, there are all sorts of folks who can be reinforcing these things, and we can be agents of change for those reinforced messages as well if we've done that work.
Yeah. Mhm. Exactly. I think that is important. Like, it speaks to this idea of systems, right? Like, systems exist and we all existed in systems. And I am someone that believes that the ways in which we come to know ourselves is through social construction. So when we interact with people, when we talk with people, that interaction gives us information that informs how we see ourselves or how we see other people, right? That social identity, that co-construction that's happening in those experiences. So when you're in a space with a client, right, that therapeutic space, whether it's a school, whether it's a nursing facility, whatever it is, that is a system. And everyone in that system plays a role, whether they're directly in the session or not, right? PCAs play a role, nurses play a role, the other residents play a role, whether they are actively engaged in that session or not. And if anything changes in that system, no matter how small or minute, it affects the whole system, which means it will affect the client or the group and you. It will affect all of those things. And so that is really important to think about too when we're doing this sort of thinking and this thought process and picking apart, because in the same ways that we get fed these messages, if we go out and co-sign on them, we're reinforcing them and we're feeding it back into that system. So then when we leave, right, the people we have just fed that thought to can then go out and feed it to other people in the system, right? And you can see how it can expand and grow and keep kind of sustaining itself. And we keep sustaining these thought processes or these biases or beliefs that maybe aren't the most conducive to creating equity within our society, right? And here we are, just music therapists who we just thought we were going in making music, but no, you're going in there affecting systems. You're going in there affecting a system in some way. And on the flip side of that, it's important to do this work because you have to be aware of where clients are coming from. What systems are they coming from when they come to see you? What beliefs and biases are they bringing in with them, right? Because in the same ways that we can affect the system, so can they, right? And they can have impact on that system. And so that's why this work feels so integral, which is why I am frustrated sometimes with undergrad programs that oftentimes will tell students, like, when you go into a space, you're the mirror or you're the blank canvas, right? And you're just there to reflect what's being given to you, and you leave yourself at the door. And I'm like, that's not it at all. Like, you can't leave you at the door. You are in that room, right? Which is why you have to think about your identities. You have to think about who you are and your lived experience and how is that showing up in that space. Case in point, I used to run an outpatient group for folks with disordered eating. And that group, by nature of kind of the area that I live in, and I think also by nature of who often has access to those services, was a group of white, mostly cisgender women, right? And so here I am going into a group as a 6'4" Black man in a space full of white people, mostly white women, or at least assigned female at birth. And for me, what I realized was going into that space, knowing those identities kind of offhand immediately affected how I operated in that space, right? Like, I physically would work to make myself look smaller so I wouldn't be threatening. I would purposely try to push to the forefront or kind of amplify these stereotypical characteristics of what like gayness was. So I was like, well, that will be non-threatening, because I don't want anything to remotely let these women think that I'm going to do harm to them. And I didn't know that in those moments, but upon reflection, I was like, oh, like, that's identity politics kind of at work, because historically, people who look like me in relationship to people who look like them, things don't necessarily always work out well for people who look like me. And so that felt really important to name. And so we have to think about those things as music therapists too, when we walk into spaces with clients, like what identities are being brought to the table and how are those things going to come into play. I know some people may not think that they impact the space, but they do, whether you're aware of it or not. People are typing some really great things in these inventories. I love this.
Thank you
Please
for
keep.
sharing those internalized things, the stereotype threats, these
Yeah.
fears of engaging in like the stereotypes about us, and
Mhm.
what we do to pull back from those. And part of it's on the safety side, just to be safe in a place that could not be, but also bringing up that therapist as a blank slate aspect, because I believed that back in the day, and it wasn't until my master's when I was doing a certificate in gender studies and things like that that I remember I read an essay, a Black feminist essay about therapy, where it was saying, be friends with your patients, invite them to things, go to the funeral. And
Yeah.
that was a little far for me, even at this stage, but to have that presented to me, to say, like, actually, this idea is based in white malehood, this idea that you can be blank, this idea that you can show up in a space and somehow be treated as like the normal non-other. And that only works for a very specific subset of people who were calling the shots for a majority of psychology's history and classical music history, which of course the marriage of those became music therapy as we know it today. And so that idea in and of itself is, it forces you to do what you did, to be less the othered identities you have, be less in the margins as you can, instead of, by and large, the more authentic you can be in a therapeutic space, the more you can actually connect and support people who need support.
And I didn't even speak to the other end of that relationship, right? Like I have no idea how they felt about me, right? In the same ways that I'm sitting here thinking about my safety, they could very well be thinking the same thing about theirs, right? And I think maybe that's important to name too, because it's easy for me to name the ways in which my marginalization comes into play, but it's a lot harder to try to step outside of that and say, oh, I do have privileges too, right? Like I am still a whole cis man that is big and able-bodied and can do a lot of things and has power in that way. And so that's important to remember too, as therapists, as people, is that we have, our identities are intersectional, and there are ways in which some of us hold marginalizations and simultaneously hold privileges, and those things don't just go away. They are always at play, and they always have a say, right? Just in the way that feminist theory says, political is personal. Like those things exist and they impact the ways in which people view and see the world. Let's see. Let's go back to my PowerPoint. All right. Back to this. So we've kind of already talked about this in a lot of ways, like how does this thinking, or how does starting to unpack some of these thinking impact the therapeutic space, right? We've hit a little bit on power dynamics at the beginning, and how those things influence who is given power and who is seen as not having the power, and who should listen to whom, right? As opposed to how do we minimize that power dynamic and make this space feel more unilateral and more collaborative, and say, I'm not here to do to you, I'm here to work with you. And I respect what your experience is, and I trust that you know your life better than I'm ever going to know your life. I'm just here to be curious about it and learn, and maybe have something to offer that you can choose to take, or you may say, I don't know if I need this piece, right? And kind of leveling that playing field, which in some ways may feel really hard, or it may on the surface look really hard, depending on who you work with as a music therapist. And how do we allow ourselves to let go of needing to have power, or let go of the inherent power that exists, and uplifting and attuning to the voices of the people we work with. We've talked about intersectional identities already. Transference and countertransference, those things exist hardcore. This is me now speaking from my analytical music therapy brain, but I find that transferences and countertransferences can be really integral to the therapeutic process, right? And if we can tap in to these sociocultural things that are happening and utilize particularly our countertransferences in a way that's conducive for therapy, like that opens up so much space, I think, for there to be more depth to the work that we do. I know the ways in which we're kind of taught about countertransference is always kind of this viewpoint of, oh, countertransference is bad and it is not good for the work. And yes, there's classical countertransference is not good for the work because it's centering you, and it's centering your stuff. But Mary Priestley, who is the pioneer of analytic music therapy, for those who are not aware, had this viewpoint of using emotional countertransference and that being really great for the therapeutic relationship. And what that speaks to is this idea of when you are working with somebody and they're sharing something or they're creating something, what comes up for you when you're witnessing and being present with them? Like, what is that feeling or that emotion, and how do you name that in that space and see like if that resonates with them or if that can add meaning to what's happening. I'll name that I come from a point of privilege in that the folks that I work with are highly verbal and engage in abstract thinking, and so can have a lot of conversations with me. But the amount of times that I feel things based on what they share, what they create, and I share that, and it opens up space for a conversation that may not have normally happened if I had not shared that thought, right? And I think that's a bigger conversation around like disclosure, right? And sort of this white supremacist idea of like we don't share anything about ourselves in therapy, it's all about the client. Whereas I think I would push against that and say, I think there are ways in which disclosures can be beneficial. Right now, obviously there are some disclosures that don't necessarily really make sense in the therapeutic space, but I think there are others that can be really helpful. Attribution error theory is this understanding that, when we think about the in group or like the dominant group, we think about positive traits being attributed inherently to them, and then on the flip side, people on the out group and having negative qualities inherently attributed to them, creating kind of this divide. It's kind of this thought of like the Black kids in school in the classroom always get in trouble, and so it's assumed that they always act up and that they don't behave well or that they're troubled, right? And that being inherently attributed to them, whereas the white kids are on the flip side and like they're well behaved, or they never say anything, or they never talk back. Like that is kind of what attribution error looks like in kind of real life ways that I've seen, or in social projection, where we have the assumption that everyone thinks similarly to us. And so that then informs what we assume about them, or what we think about them, or how we think they're going to engage or think about something, right? And having to deconstruct those things and break that down and let go, and really come from this understanding of you don't know the things. Like your life is not their life. Their experience is not your experience. Even if you have similar identities, your experiences may have some overlaps, but they're still vastly different in a lot of ways. And having to recognize that and be okay with being curious about it, and being okay with not being the expert and not having to know all the things. I especially want to give that to my newer professionals or my music therapy students, right? You don't have to know all the things, and it's okay if you don't, right? That is when you really can fully allow yourself to sit in that, it is such a freeing thing to say, oh, I don't have to know the answer. I don't have to know the thing. It's okay. I can just be present and go with the flow. And that has such opportunity and space for something really beautiful to come out of that session, because I didn't feel the need to have to know, or I didn't have to control something. I could just let it be and be flexible. We talked a little bit, or actually we've not really talked a lot about how it impacts approaches to care, right? Thinking about how we think about experiences we create and make with clients. Doing this work allows us to let go of maybe these more Western ideas of what we should be doing and goals and objectives, and feeling like we have to exactly match what's happening here, or we have to make sure that we're doing everything the IEP says or everything the doctor's chart says. Again, not thinking about the whole context of that person that day when you see them, and recognizing that, what that chart says may not necessarily be what is needed that day. And if you don't hit it, that's okay. Right. And really centering that individual or that group, as opposed to centering the organization or the system that person exists within. It also impacts the music choices, right? Like, how are you picking music? How are you engaging with music? How are you censoring music? I know that's always a big conversation that comes up in music therapy circles, is censorship around music and what is deemed appropriate and what's not deemed appropriate. Again, appropriate by whose standards, right? Like, what values are feeding that notion? Even when we think about what we label as problems, right? I think now with a lot of like mad studies and mad theory, I think there's starting to be a lot more access to people understanding that, autism is not a problem, right? Autism is not this thing to be fixed. It is a way of living that people experience that strays from what the system has said is normal, or what the system has said is right. And so for some reason we've decided to label that as a problem. But I think now a lot of spaces are starting to let go of that as being a problem, even though we're still upholding this notion of trying to normalize and make normal, right? And so that's how we as music therapists still sometimes uphold these beliefs, right? Because we have jobs, and the jobs that give us money to pay our bills say we have to do these things. And they say, the child needs to be able to make eye contact with somebody because that's how they're going to get by in the world. And even though we have voices from lots of autistic people that say making eye contact is painful and it's not conducive to my success in this world, right? But we're still pushed to do it because the system says, if you want to make it, if you want to pay your bills this month, you got to do it. And so that's where we really move from a space of capitalism to activism, right? And how does activism come into play in the music therapy space, and how are we advocating for clients when we have a full understanding of their social context and how that influences the work? And when do we push back against systems that are trying to continue to subjugate and oppress? Which moves us into, well, what do? We engage in transformative learning, which is really just kind of what I've been talking about this whole presentation, is this process of really kind of deconstructing what you have known to be true your whole life, which again is really hard and takes a lot of time, because depending on how long you've been on the earth, that's a lot of years of unpacking to do, and allowing how you perceive and understand the world to change, right? Which comes with reevaluating a lot of your beliefs and values and assumptions. So even the inventory that I just posted is a good starting point on trying to deconstruct these thoughts and really think about them, and what do you actually believe versus what you don't, and how do the things that you don't believe in maybe pop up in how you engage with clients or with people, and how do you catch yourself and step away from it if that's what you need to do to better serve the folks you work with. That is what transformative learning is. I think that's really what I got. So I am really open to questions, comments, critiques, all the things. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Yeah. So we didn't get any questions through the app situation. And let's do one. I have a question though. Just, I'm interested in what I know. For me, there have been various aha moments in my journey. There have been moments where I was like, oh my God, like I didn't realize, and one of my like things I say, one of my kind of mantras I have for myself is that perspective is a gift. That there are these moments we have in life that we just have this moment of perspective. And so I'm wondering, what was your most recent, or what was a meaningful aha moment for you in this journey?
Yeah, I think something that really sticks with me is when I was in grad school. Um, my professor, Dr. Hadley, gave us this assignment where it was a whole list of just things that you could engage in as a person. And essentially, the activity kind of asked you to think about, like, oh, is this something that you have to actively think about in your world or not? And so it would be things like, oh, when you are walking home, when you're walking to your car at night, do you have to think about your safety, or do you have to think about if something's going to happen to you? And that got into this whole discussion about like misogyny, right? And sexism. And in my head, I found myself being really defensive because I was like, oh, well, I don't think I'm sexist at all, or I'm not misogynist at all. I was like, I was raised by a single mom for a good portion of time in my life. And my grandmother was also very present in my life. And I have always viewed them as kind of being the heads of households and making a lot of decisions when it came to the family and keeping the family together. And so I was like, there's no way. And it, I, I really had to get taken to task on that thought, and really made to understand that what Professor Hadley was really trying to get to me was, you may not actively and consciously be sexist or misogynistic, but you uphold the things and the systems in place that support misogyny and sexism. And that was hard to swallow at the time, but it was a big aha moment for me, because that was kind of this almost kind of a cognitive distortion, not a cognitive dissonance. It was a cognitively dissonant moment for me, where I was like, yes, I see that, but this. And I think that was defenses happening for me. So that was a big moment for me, and having to realize, yeah, I may not actively be imposing things that uphold those things, but I am covertly supporting or unconsciously supporting those things in a lot of ways, which is something I think, if we try to make parallels to when we talk to white people about race, and we try to tell white people like, oh, I don't think you're racist, but this behavior that you've engaged in supports racism or upholds racism, and they are unable to receive that message, because again, it goes back to this dichotomy of, oh, am I a good person or am I a bad person? And so that was me when it came to misogyny and sexism. So I think that is a big aha moment that still sits with me.
Yeah, that with all the isms, recognizing that it's not I am or I am not one of these, racist or sexist or whatnot. We all have internalized beliefs based on a society that upholds these things culturally and structurally. There's no way to avoid it, And so the best we can do is be honest with ourselves and build stamina to be able to have that hard conversation internally or with someone else to say, oh yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
And curiosity. I think curiosity is the goal. I think
I think curiosity is, I love leaning in with curiosity, whether it's outside of sessions or inside sessions. And it's great to, I'm really thankful for the people that I surround myself with. I have one friend of mine who is a white bi woman who's a social worker, and I affectionately call her the walking pamphlet, because she's very big into activism, and if she could have a pamphlet for anything, she would have a pamphlet and would give it to you in a heartbeat. And so I feel like I learn a lot from people like her on things and issues that don't necessarily directly impact me, even though they still affect me. And I think that's another important thing to name too, is I think sometimes when something happens that we feel like is not directly related to us, we feel like, oh, we have no say in the matter, or we have no reason to get involved, but we do.
Yeah.
Right. And I think when we start to understand, when we are able to meet the needs of the most marginalized people in this world, then we inherently are meeting the needs of all people. And when we can wrap our heads around that as a society and start thinking in that way, think of what that opens up. Think of how we could change policy. Think of how we could make things more equitable in terms of pay, in terms of access to care, in terms of access to education, and all of those things. But I think there's this inherent fear, particularly from like cis white men with power and money, but like anyone in dominant groups, that there's this fear that if they really, if power was given to those who are marginalized, then they themselves would lose the power. They would lose power. And that's not the point. That's not how that works, right? It's like if we were allowed to step into the power, right? If we were allowed to step into that power and raise that bar that way, it doesn't change anything for you. If anything, it probably helps you in some ways. And so what you're actually doing by continuing to oppress is you're working against yourself, even though you think it's in your best interest, but it's really not.
Absolutely. The fear of losing privilege holds a lot of people back from actually engaging in things. And sometimes that is the ask, is to stick your neck out in a way that you could lose privileges.
And that's what allyship is, right? I think that's important. Like, I think a lot of people just think allyship is, saying that you stand with somebody, and like, not really. Right. I was like, allyship is when you are willing to put your neck on the line to the extent where you have something to lose, and you could very well lose it, but you do it because that's what is necessary, right? And when people are ready to do that, that is really where allyship comes into play, right? And I think right now there are many people that get stuck in this performative allyship that doesn't really do much for those that they are trying to be allies for.
Yeah, it's more about performing for each other than it is for actually supporting the people who need it. Yeah, it's one of my great pet peeves. Well, on that, thank you so much, Freddie, for sharing your time with us. Sorry, it's glitching a little bit sometimes. I'm breaking up.
It's fine. I heard all the things.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for your
Can
time.
you hear me? Is it on my end?
It might be on your end. But thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, for sharing your life experience and vulnerability, and giving us a really great chat about, about being more self-aware and about introspection, and and trying to make things better. Thank you for your time and energy. And sorry again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. No technology like now.
Okay. All right, I'm going to stop the recording, or I'm going to stop the live stream. Thank you everyone for watching. Thanks for being here. And we're having another event here next month. Here, I'm going to just do a quick pitch for that so you can put it in your planners. Our next talk is on January 11th at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. Eastern. That's with Dr. Rebecca West. And we're going to have a great time chatting with her too. I'll be back. And we'll have the Zoom stuff better figured out next time. So thank you, Freddie, for being our guinea pig with this, and for letting us, and your patience.
All for the messiness, all here for it.
All here for the messiness. Appreciate that reframe. All right, everybody, have a great night.
Night, everyone. Thank you so much.